Telephones and Simon Stevens, Director of Casework for Addictions UK in the North East. Good morning to you, Simon.
Good morning.
So is this a public health matter, a medical matter, or should it be simply for the courts?
It's definitely a medical matter. It's a public health matter. It's useful to understand there's two areas being brought up here. One is one of addiction and the other is of drug use. And that many young people will experiment with drugs. They will come to a conclusion. That conclusion often is it's not for them, and they move on with the rest of their lives.
What would you say to those who wonder if you start taking cannabis and soft drugs, if you like, that there'll be an increase in the use of harder drugs and you go from one to the other?
That's a very difficult question to answer because there's no actual research that I'm aware of that totally supports or totally explains what happens with the pathways of drugs. One argument could be, for example, that you decriminalise cannabis, therefore you take it away from the dealers who also have the harder drugs. But then the side effect of that might be that you increase the use of cannabis because you're saying it's legal. It's very complicated, and we don't have to change the laws or anything to see that happening. We already have it with legal highs, we already have it with alcohol, which is legal, but we know there's a real abuse problem with it. Ironically, we're kind of saying that some people are saying that perhaps we should decriminalise drugs, while at the same time other people are saying, well, perhaps we should make tobacco almost illegal. They're almost swapping positions. Doing that is not really going to help things. It's simply just going to change the dynamics.
If you're saying that, it's a medical issue, how about from the outset saying you get caught, this is what will happen. You get caught, you'll have a harder term, whether it's a prison term or a harder fine, rather than just a slap on the wrist. As some would say, well, if you start off really with a hard line here, eventually it will eradicate the problem.
All I can say to that is have you ever been a teenager? Did you ever pay any attention to the consequences of your actions, or did you really just say, I'm going to do this?
But if you got caught, then there would be a consequence.
There would be a consequence. We don't, as teenagers, we don't terribly think about consequences, do we?
Probably not, but if there was a harder line and that we all knew, it's not just a case of getting caught and you'll be grounded or you're going to get a slap on the wrist or you'll have your pocket money revoked or you might get a bit of a caution. If you're caught, there'll be huge sanctions in that it'll be a criminal record. It'll go onto your record forever. You will, have problems in getting a job. You'll maybe end up in young offenders institute.
I don't think any of those things occur to a lot of young people, to be quite frank.
Because they're not in place. If they were in place, it might make a difference.
Well, it might, but there again, you'd have to do some sort of research to validate that argument. I think most people with teenagers know that teenagers tend to act on the spur of the moment, and we know that sanctions don't particularly work. We already have sanctions, and they don't particularly work very well. We have sanctions for all kinds of things. Education is a far better route. There's just been some recent research in America where they use brief intervention techniques with students who were demonstrating a drug use issue, and they reckon that their drug use went down considerably within the first 2 or 3 brief interventions.
What does that mean, a brief intervention?
A brief intervention is simply a small amount of treatment. If you remember the old adage, a stitch in time saves 9.
And so what would that treatment be?
That would be around a counselling sort of approach. I'm not totally au fait with exactly what they were doing. I think they were going to young people and saying, well, okay, this is maybe what you've heard about drugs. This is perhaps another way of looking at things. These are possible health consequences that you may suffer from using drugs.
The people that you deal with, the clients perhaps that you have, is there a common thread in their drug use? Is there one more prevalent than others?
You mean in the types of drugs they use? No, I wouldn't say that. Well, yes, there is actually alcohol. By far the greatest problem is with alcohol.
So it's booze then, which clearly is totally legal.
Booze is totally legal, and it is the one with the massive problem. Because at an early age we all learn that, hey, you can have a drink and things, but for some of us, and it is only for some of us, this goes on to create major problems. And drugs are very similar, that most people say, which then you have to categorise the drugs. But with the case of cannabis, most people could choose to have a cannabis cookie if they wanted, or they could choose not to have one. A small number of people will find that they become psychologically, pathologically dependent on that cannabis, or in the case of alcohol, they become dependent on the alcohol. It's not just a physical dependency. It becomes a way of coping with a huge emotional problems that they're suffering.
Do emotional problems... People that come along to see you who have a lot of emotional sort of baggage, for want of a better word, when they were brought up as young people, their parents were in a spiral of drinking too much.
When we say emotional problems,
yeah.
It's not so much that they have extra emotional problems, although that can rarely be the case. It is that particular section of society is incredibly sensitive. Their sensitivity switch is turned up really high. So when everyday emotions that most of us can cope with affixed to us, that we find those very... I'm talking as a recovering addict and alcoholic, by the way, that we find those emotions are incredibly powerful and uncomfortable, and subconsciously a message goes out, in the past when you've had a drink or when you've had a smoke or whatever, that's taken away that painful feeling. Subconsciously, that message reemerges, and they find that they have to use, to kind of take away that feeling. It clearly sits in the medical domain for people who have addiction issues in this way.
Thanks very much, Simon. It's interesting just to hear you as a recovering alcoholic, and what I've found when you're saying booze is the common denominator.
Big drug for him, yeah. Let's recap the headline on this. Sally Davis has called for illegal drug addiction to be treated as a public health issue rather than a criminal one. We're asking you, what do you think about this? Is drug abuse a medical problem or a criminal problem? Your experience particularly valuable on this.